All right, everyone, here we are at the end of the day, section 3 of today's lecture. So really just one last topic to talk about here with relation to chapter 13 and our discussion of the Fed. And that is, should central banks be as independent as they are, right? So in other words, should central banks largely have free reign to do what they want to do, right? Or should there be more structure on central banks, right? Congress can't do what they want without a check of the president. President can't do what he wants. You might think he can, but the president can't do what he wants without checks and balances. Should that same thing hold for the Federal Reserve? So let's talk about this question a little bit. So let's talk about this question of sorry, I can find it. How independent should central banks be? Let's first talk about this argument of no, right? Because there are many critics of the Federal Reserve who have really are troubled by the fact that the Fed is so independent. Their first complaint is that this is essentially undemocratic, right? That the Fed has no public accountability in the same way that the president or Congress does, right? Nobody in the Federal Reserve is elected to their position. They're nominated, they're approved, but they're not elected. They never have to face voters. And so this actually is giving elites an incredible power, right? That is not directly related to the electoral process. People have said that the chairperson of the Federal Reserve is the second most powerful person in the United States. I think that's probably a bit of an overstatement, but certainly they are one of the more powerful policymakers in the world, and yet they've never faced election, right? There's also this question of, are the Fed's objectives yours, right? If you look at who works at the Federal Reserve, how do you get to this point to be working at the Federal Reserve? Almost inevitably, you're either an academic or you've come up through the banking system, right? And if you look at the vast majority of the people who have gone to the Fed, they are highly educated, they are privileged, they tend to be inordinately white, they tend to be heavily male, and undoubtedly they're rich. And so, that's a real question, right? Does the Fed think about the interests of the average American, or do they think about the interests of white, privileged, male Americans, right? I think that's a legitimate question to ask about the Fed. And then finally, listen, there is no guarantee that expertise guarantees its success, right? Right, we can and we will point to many mistakes that the Fed has made throughout history, right? Being an academic economist doesn't mean that you know everything about economics, right? Maybe I prove that every day. So, expertise doesn't necessarily guarantee success. So this idea that we need experts at the Fed, well, I'm sympathetic to it. I mean, you can also argue that experts make mistakes as well. Having said all this, I do think that there are strong reasons for central bank independence. First, there is undoubtedly this inflationary bias at the Fed, right? If you put politicians in charge, and I think we've seen this under President Trump always wants to stimulate the economy. He never thinks about trying to slow the economy down. It's always the economy can grow faster and faster and faster. The problem with that mentality, as we're going to see, is that it creates a lot of consequences in terms of interest rate volatility, in terms of inflation volatility, including excessive debt. And so while in the short run, it might be great to grow faster, you're not thinking nearly enough about the long term. And so by giving a central bank some independence, what you're really trying to do is take the hands out of monarchs or elected politicians and put it in the hands of those who have an interest in promoting stability and thinking about the long run over the short run, right? And that is the fundamental argument for an independent central bank, to have somebody who's interested in promoting stability, not just immediate gratification. We know that inflation is costly. As we've talked about, inflation creates winners and losers. It creates menu costs. It leads to misallocation as people put their money in ways to protect themselves from inflation, and encourages bad policy, right? So inflation inevitably leads to worse economic outcomes. And so, um, right, having more independent central banks really encourages us to think more about the long term and not the short term. There's also this problem of political business cycles, that politicians will think about using monetary policy to win elections, right? There are some really great snippets of the Watergate tapes from Richard Nixon, in which he called up the chairman of the Federal Reserve and basically swore him up a blue streak about how the Fed is not doing enough to get him elected, right? And there's some actual evidence that it worked, that the Fed actually cut interest rates right before the 72 election in ways that helped Nixon win an election. But of course, that shouldn't be the main goal of monetary policy, right? Winning elections is not the goal of monetary policy. And so by making central banks more independent, hopefully you're protecting them more from that. There's also the danger that, if you put politicians in charge of the Fed, they're going to want to print money to pay the bills, right? It's really tempting to let your central bank pay the bills. But the problem with that, of course, is inflation, right? And long-term instability. There is an argument to be said that this is just too complicated for politicians, right? I think every time you see the chairman of the Federal Reserve testify before Congress, and you hear the questions that Congress people ask of the chairman of the Fed, you really think these people don't know anything. And I'm talking about Congress people, right? Listen, this is complicated stuff, right? I mean, you certainly understand that, right? Because you're in this class, right? Not all of this is easy. And so, the average American doesn't know much about it, and maybe the average politician knows even less. So, the analogy here is the Supreme Court, right? We don't just let anybody go into the Supreme Court. You have to be an expert in the law. Maybe the same should hold for the central bank, that you should at least be a reasonable expert in monetary policy. Finally, I would like to say that, to say that the Fed is undemocratic, it could be a complaint made about most aspects of our government, right? We are not a true democracy. We are a republic. There's all sorts of checks and balances, right? So we don't just let the majority rule on most questions. And this is really the same when it comes to monetary policy, right? If we let the majority rule, there's an argument to be said that because there's more borrowers than lenders, that people would always vote for inflation because that's good for borrowers in general and it's bad for lenders. But of course, that's going to ruin the financial system and hurt everybody in the long run, right? We don't just run monetary policy on majority rule, nor should we. And so, they call the Fed undemocratic. Well, yeah, that's kind of the point, right? That's kind of the point. Just like we don't have majority rule on most things in this republic, why should we expect to have majority rule on monetary policy? So if you actually look at the empirical work on this, there's been a lot of empirical work that suggests that if you look across countries, there has definitely been this trend towards central bank independence. And the good thing about this is there's a lot of evidence that central bank independence actually leads to lower inflation. In 1980, 2/3 of the countries in the world had inflation of greater than 10%, and 1/3 were experiencing negative output growth, and financial crises were common. But if you look at today, only 1 out of 6 countries have inflation greater than 10%. And economic growth has never been as broadly enjoyed. This is setting aside the pandemic, right? I'm talking more broadly about the last 10 years or so. This has been a great time for the global economy, a period of low inflation. And part of that is because governments have learned that central banks work best when they're independent. And they are held politically accountable, but they're held politically accountable to the public through being transparent in their actions, right? In other words, when the public knows what the Federal Reserve and the central bank is doing, and they can convince the public that they're doing the right thing, then this problem of is the Fed democratic or not becomes much less of a deal, right? And so the Fed has seen this. In many ways, the Fed has become the gold standard for modern central banks. And one of the ways that they become the gold standard is that they have tried to become much more transparent, tried to engage the public and make it clear to the public that what they're doing is a good thing, right? And try to explain to the public what they're doing and why. And so this just goes to illustrate what I was talking about before. Here's looking at inflation rates and inflation targets for 3 countries. And we can see this across many countries, is these countries are countries that moved to more independent central banks that were to focus on inflation. And the move to independence greatly not only reduced the level of inflation, but also reduced the volatility of inflation, right? And so this is true of a lot of different countries. So yes, the Fed has definitely worked on trying to make itself more transparent. Unfortunately, that hasn't solved the problems, right? That doesn't mean that there aren't any critics of the Fed out there. And just to kind of, one of the big critics of the Fed is, of course, the president, right? Who's always tweeting that he wants the Fed to lower interest rates. And we'll talk about that here in a second. There has been this bill that's been put before Congress for many years here, asking for Congress to audit the Fed, right? Now, an audit of the Fed might sound pretty milquetoast or not a particularly big deal, but really what this bill is aimed at, as it says here, is it's time to bring the Fed into the sunshine of accountability, right? Basically, a lot of this audit bill that has been proposed by Republicans is really a way of trying to limit the flexibility of the Fed, right? Trying to limit the flexibility of the Fed. This article here, you can read this, is really talking about Donald Trump and his tweeting, right? And one way you can see this tweeting is Trump has been gradually trying to weaken the Federal Reserve's independence, make the Fed more accountable to him by using public pressure, not accountable to the public, not accountable to promoting money or economic and monetary stability, but more accountable to him and to pursue his political objectives, right? And listen, if you actually talk to most politicians, they actually, at least traditionally, have liked the independence of the Fed, because the Fed goes about and does their job, and then if things don't work out, they can scapegoat the Fed, right? The Fed becomes an easy scapegoat. So many politicians in the past haven't really wanted to run monetary policy. They're happy to have the Fed out there as a scapegoat. And sometimes I think that's what Trump's trying to do. Yes, he's trying to influence the Fed's policy, but I think he's also happy to have the Fed out there and for the Fed not to do what he wants, because then he can just blame them, right? It becomes an easy blame game. Having said that, this article really is looking at measures of transparency, or how open central banks are. And you can see across all of these central banks, the major central banks in the world, there has been a decided increase in the amount of transparency that the central banks have engaged in. Central banks, relative to 10 or 15 years ago, are so much more open about what are they doing, right? I think I talked earlier in class about how the Fed, whenever the Federal Open Market Committee meets, they immediately publish their minutes so that everybody can see what they talk about. They release all of their forecasting data. They release all of their policy options that they considered, right? There's this huge deluge of information that the Fed shares with the public that didn't used to be out there, right? Just tell you a story from when I'm in graduate school. I was interested in how the Fed makes its decisions. And so I actually wanted to see some of these policy documents. The only way that you could see these policy documents was get a written letter from somebody at the Fed. Then I had to physically go to Washington, D.C., go to a library, sign in, look at the copies. I could make notes, but I could not make any copies. And then as I left the library, I got searched to make sure I didn't make any copies, right? It was kind of like going into the archives of, I don't know what, right? Like some sort of Soviet Union archives or archives of the Chinese Communist Party, or something where you could find some information that was so valuable and so damaging that nobody could let you have it. And that's kind of the way that the Fed behaved. And I think in part it was just because there's this idea that we're doing important stuff. And so people shouldn't know what we're doing. But that's so much different than how the Fed behaves today, right? I mean, I would say that the Fed is genuinely invested in transparency, in part because the Fed realizes if they're not transparent, it makes it harder for them to do their job, right? Because um, the more that they're transparent, the more essentially leeway that the public gives them to do difficult things, right? And so, I would say that most economists are big supporters of this independence of the Fed because we see it working. That doesn't mean that it doesn't make us a little uncomfortable as, Democrats, not Democrats with a big D, but Democrats meaning people who support democracy. But we also have to realize we live in a republic, right? And that there's constraints on our ability to influence lots of policy. And this is probably one area where those constraints are the fact that our voting is limited probably has many benefits, more benefits than it does costs. At least that's my opinion. I am an economist. All right, that will finish up our discussion of Chapter 13. On Monday, which would be day 11, we're going to move into talking about some of the mechanics of monetary policy. So have a good weekend. Remember that homework number 3 is due next week. You should work on it. See you in office hours today.